Okay, we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Bridging the Gap, Implementing Interoperability for Learning in Employment Records. My name is Erin Fay Caesar, and this afternoon we'll discuss LERs and interoperability and how it leads to improved student educational outcomes. Today's webinar will start with an introduction to our speakers and Project Unicorn. Then we'll move into learning and employment records and North Dakota digital credentials. Then we'll move on to some prepared questions we have for our speakers today and Q&A, and then we'll wrap it up with our closing. Today's webinar includes a Q&A segment, so please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A chat at any point during the webinar, and you can find the Q&A button between the chat and participants icon in the toolbar below. Again, my name is Erin Fay Caesar, and I am the Project Associate for Project Unicorn. And today we are joined by Amanda Winters, who's a Program Director for National Governors Association, and Tracy Korsmo from the North Dakota Information Technology Department, where he serves as the State Longitudinal Data System Program Manager. For those who don't know, Project Unicorn is an initiative of Innovate EDU, a coalition of national education organizations aimed at enhancing data interoperability in K-12 education. We strive to foster a community of innovators by collaborating with school systems and vendors, providing resources, and driving demand for data interoperability through partnerships. We are led by our steering committee, and we are funded by the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So before we jump into LERs, I want to give a little bit more background of interoperability. And interoperability is the seamless, secure, and controlled exchange of data between applications. Interoperability can transform teaching and learning by giving teachers the information they need to succeed, enabling innovation in classroom practices to help guide students with their own data. Interoperability fosters cross-platform collaborations, making it possible to pool resources and knowledge from various edtech platforms. This integration of systems not only increases efficiency, but also promotes innovation in learning strategies and methodologies. At Project Unicorn, we offer webinars, publications, and support through technical assistant calls to help districts and vendors understand the importance of interoperability. We highlight its benefits, creating demand through partnerships, and educating buyers on the total cost of ownership through informed comparison of vendors. Our ultimate goal is to help districts achieve a modernized and efficient data infrastructure, enhancing safety and overhaul system performance. And without further ado, I'll be handing this off to Amanda Winters, who will further explain LERs.
Hey, folks. It's so great to join you today. As Erin mentioned, my name is Amanda Winters. I'm Program Director for Post-Secondary Education at the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices. And I'm going to talk a little bit about learning and employment records, and then some of the intersections that has brought the National Governors Association to this work, and some of the policy space. I will start out my comments by saying I am not a tech person or an in-the-weeds data process person. So my connection to these policy areas really live in the big picture connections and the why of some of this work, and why governors and state policy makers should care about it, and then sort of the big picture connections along to some of the other spaces outside of post-secondary education, into some of the different agency spaces that governors can think about. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as I dive into some of these details. But wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the ways in which we see learning and employment record systems connecting across some different use cases. So I'll give a little bit of background on the reasons why the National Governors Association is engaged in this work. There's several states who are thinking about digital credentials, certainly North Dakota being one. Excited to hear from Tracy in a few about some of the work that they're doing in his state to advance some of these efforts. But several states were very interested in learning and employment records and digital credentials and ways in which to leverage technology to ease some of the friction points between education and training transitions and education to employment pathways, and then also some other use cases that exist outside of that just sort of education to work pipeline. But the learning and employment record space sort of sits in an area of great, governor priority. We want to get more people to and through training and into employment settings. So this is an exciting way for technology to be able to address some of those points of transition and making records more accessible and movable for the learner and worker. And so we leaned in a couple years ago, 3 or 4 years ago now, and brought together some of those states in a learning community to say, what are you guys trying? Where are your barriers? Why are you doing this work? So the why of it's super important to us, so that we can talk to other states about sort of what this work looks like and why it's an area of priority and investment. So a core of this is building on state data systems and interconnection of data between state systems and then to external places like, education opportunities, maybe in state or out of state, and then also employers. And then states were thinking, oh, we could also, if we connected our data systems, have better internal efficiencies that can speak to the needs, the business case of our agency to our constituents. So connections of things like housing data, childcare data, some of these things that, correctional data that can sort of build out the profile of a person that is accessing state resources, state engagement, as well as learning and employment opportunities. So there's sort of that tip of the spear being the learning and employment record conversation around how do we move people through post-secondary or K-12 opportunities. So from education into those next steps, but then also what else can sort of surround that learner, that worker in a data sense from a state perspective. So thinking about how we leverage all of our state data connections to support these individuals within our state to be, to move more seamlessly through our transition points. And this also brought up several areas of impact that have been an area of priority for us, which are data privacy and security. Certainly at the K-12 level, this is a high point of priority for states. The data of minors is a touchy subject, as it should be, with policymakers and legislators in states. We're seeing lots of movement right now in the data privacy around social media. That's happening at the state and federal level. Those conversations around how minors are engaging with any of these places that collect and utilize their data. Right now, the focus is social media, but it's affecting lots of things. Ed tech of all types is a part of the conversation around the utilization and the security and privacy of data. And then also some of the things that came out from some of our conversations around learning and employment records, which are those, all of those different ways in which data is moved around about an educational experience is captured about that and moved through systems, or employment verification or experience or work-based learning that is captured about a learner and then can be utilized by them to do whatever next educational or workforce step they want to take. So that connection to employers and workforce needs, I think, is a key one that states are grappling with right now, is thinking about all the work we're putting into digital credentials, which I know is something that's happening in North Dakota, and capturing some of these skills pathways or these experiences around work-based learning or apprenticeship, and how those can be transferred into employment consideration and decisions around hiring. Right now, there's bridges are being built between some of this data and HR intake systems. So when I'm thinking about this from a policy perspective, I'm really thinking about the mobility of data that currently exists, and then the enhancement of the data that can be added to that. And a key point for that is the interoperability and the structure of interoperability for this type of data that's moving through our systems and has a variety of priorities around its usage and application. So there are some states that are leveraging their own digital wallets, like the state of Colorado that has the My Colorado app. Some are working with vendors to help to build out some of their systems so that they can have access to digital wallets, which are those online sort of holders of these individual experiences and digital records of learning and employment. So that will also bring up the conversation around how to engage with vendors. So the interoperability conversation, super important to establish the need for that at the state level, and then to translate that into what does the procurement language look like for vendors? What are some of the models and templates for interoperability that need to be implemented in order to make sure the true interoperability is achieved? And I would point you towards some recent Project Unicorn briefs. I leaned into the one on state policy conversations, but there are several more. They're talking about really the specific, data models, the how and why of interoperability. So we'll point you towards those, and I know Tracy's going to talk some about that today. I'm again approaching this from a policy perspective, as thinking about sort of the why of the connection. And then there are the mechanics of the connection that move down into our procurement processes and the engagement with vendors. And then from a governor's perspective, where should this work be housed? Where does this live? It's going to live in different spaces in different states. But the thread of interoperability is an important one to pull across all of our agency data systems in order that we have the interoperability internally, as well as our conversation about interoperability with external stakeholders, other platforms, different states, educational institutions, employers, other digital wallets, so that the learner and worker have maximum mobility with their data to move across our systems. So, as I mentioned, North Dakota has been a state that's been informing us due to the work that they are implementing. And I'm excited to hear more about Tracy's ongoing experience with the implementation of interoperability principles, the discussion of digital credentials, and all the interagency connections that are happening in the state of North Dakota. It's always great for the National Governors Association to think a big picture, but be able to point to these experts in the field, which are our state leaders who are you're taking the lead on these efforts. So, Tracy, in order to dive into some of this a little bit deeper, I'd love to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Amanda. It's always a pleasure to present with somebody like Amanda who has got this broad view of digital credentialing, because it's not a technical project unto itself. In all my technical career, this is the one that takes a village. It takes educators, it takes workforce development, it takes the governor's office, it takes agency heads. It's a lot of moving parts, very difficult to coordinate. So really appreciate the work that the NGA is doing in that area. I am the SLDS program manager, and with that in North Dakota, we have a very robust statewide longitudinal data system. And when I say that is we have pillars, 3 pillars, one K-12, post-secondary, and then workforce are our 3 strong pillars. And when I say that is they have their own data warehouses. So we're a hybrid SLDS, meaning I can dip into any of these data warehouses and join to create a centralized system. So from that, we do all the public reporting. We have educator portals. We have student parent portals off the SLDS data. We have a statewide e-transcript system, scholarship management system, choice ready type of applications, digital credentialing now, and college applications. And these are just some of the services that we provide from our SLDS. But the SLDS is what has really allowed North Dakota to get into LERs at a faster rate, especially with like the e-transcript system is where we concentrated on at first for developing a wallet. The project started off as a blockchain project to prove in government how we could use blockchain, but that quickly morphed into an LER project. And really the whole blockchain encryption, that's just utility behind the scenes. It's really not even a topic here in North Dakota anymore. But one thing I did want to do today is just take you through what an LER looks like in North Dakota today. We are going through some work now, starting this fall, that is going to modernize a lot of all of this. But we start from a student's transcript here, and the student does have agency over their own wallet, and they can publish their own digital credential, their own high school transcript. They can establish their wallet here as well, and publish their high school transcript. We're doing this through a series of technologies. We have the North Dakota State e-transcript. We use the Open Credential Publisher, which formerly RANDA, now Level Data, repurposed some of their software and created an open source Open Credential Publisher, which receives comprehensive learner records and does all the signing and creates a W3C verifiable credential, as well as the wallet that North Dakota is currently using. As we go through that, then you're going to see the student's experience with the wallet here. The typical login, we can log in with proof, which is basically a QR code as well. And then we get into the wallet where the student is allowed to share their credentials, accumulate their credentials, investigate them. They can curate collections of their credentials today, meaning they can combine multiple CLRs for a presentation, as well as they can go using Open Badges 2.1. They can go to Canvas and pull in Open Badges today. Was the 2.0 going quickly into the 3.0 version of that. So as we look at a high school transcript, if we look at the grain of a grade on a course, each one of these assertions is signed, as well as, obviously having the grade on the course. If we look at the details of what's behind that CLR, you're going to see that it is a verifiable credential that you can verify itself. And as we dig into the details of an individual course, you'll see the signing of an individual assertion. So in the future, one could share off a single assertion from a CLR containing 60 different assertions. And then we have alignments. And in this case, what you're seeing is alignments to the state standards that define algebra. So when we go into that, North Dakota used OpenSalt. So that's case.nd.gov. So here, the Department of Public Instruction has defined all of their state course codes, as well as the state standards on the courses as well. So that metadata can be interrogated as we do exchange credentials. Also, we do provide evidence in the CLR. This is the ability to store a visual presentation of the transcript within the CLR. This kind of fights off the cold start issue that, people are not consuming CLRs today. I think North Dakota, I don't know whether we're the first, but we are going to be exchanging our first CLR with a scholarship management system that the university system is implementing via PCG. And so that will be the first time that we exchange CLRs with a third-party vendor. Here you're seeing the ability for an individual to share a credential. Today, it's almost all by email. Today, they invite participants to receive the credential. That person can log into the system, input an access key, and get access to the credential. They can download the PDF version or take the CLR if they choose. And so here you're seeing the email that would be coming out to an individual to receive a credential, putting in their access key, and then they have the ability to download the PDF or the CLR. So one thing I'll pause here and say is this first version of our wallet is very much so an engineer's design due to the complexity of understanding all the signing and all the assertions. North Dakota really does have a technical version of a wallet, and that's what we'll be implementing later on this summer, is a much more friendlier version of the wallet itself, as well as upgrades to OB 3.0 and CLR 2.0 versions. Here you're just seeing them pulling in badges from Canvas, such that I can now pull in my badges and put that into my wallet. Currently, that's an OB 2.0. As soon as the 3.0s are flowing, the 3.0 will be a verifiable credential and essentially just be a single assertion into a CLR. Yeah, here's me curating a collection as well. We've done a lot of work with pathways, and we did work with Credential Engine as well as formerly Badger, now Canvas, mapping out pathways. We worked with Community College, Bismarck State College, and defined their cybersecurity program, which is stackable credentials, leading to an associate's degree all the way through a bachelor's degree. So those pathways and all those credentials are defined within Credential Engine today. And here you're seeing the amount of work that went into the cybersecurity progression level. The state of North Dakota has got state standards on cybersecurity in the state at grade level, starting in kindergarten. So these are some of the areas that we would like to be working on, publishing achievement credentials at the grade level. What we're currently working on in North Dakota is called the North Dakota Awarding Service, and this is an open source project that we will publish. And what this is provides the ability for state institutions or licensing divisions in the state to define and publish their own credentials. We don't want a technical engagement every time an education institution or a licensing agency wants to create a digital credential. So we're providing that infrastructure for them. That's one thing that we're doing at the state, and the power of the SLDS is allowing us to do is we have created a state system for the open credential publisher, which is really providing a registry, if you will. Only we allow entities in the state to publish credentials from the state open credential publisher, and the North Dakota Awarding Service will be available to any of the state government entities and school entities in the state as well. This is just kind of a view of it. Our original design on this, very much so mimicked or we came to the same results as MIT's project of the DCC, and basically storing JSON, parameterized JSON of the credential. One thing we are going to be doing is creating a visual credential builder too for the end user community here. And so this is kind of what it looks behind the scenes, is you've really literally got this JSON in there. With that, that kind of concludes my presentation of just what an LER looks like today in North Dakota. We've taken probably the last 8 months kind of for a breather, because it was a very heavy engagement for us to get this far. Everybody needed a break. And now we're going through another round where I am going to be using the SLDS, and what I'll be doing is connecting to, we harvest all 11 institutions' data on a daily basis, degrees and credentials. So we're going to start awarding all credentials and degrees as digital credentials for the institutions here in North Dakota. We're finishing up a project for all the institutions to publish the definition of their credentials to Credential Engine, who's a very strong partner in this. And that's our phase now in North Dakota, and hoping to get back into another engagement with the workforce again. But that has been a strong challenge in North Dakota, because we don't have an agency that was created to really address this with the workforce community. Our workforce people are wearing 5 hats already today, and it's really difficult for them to engage in the employers as a secondary job. And the amount of communications, marketing that needs to be done, outreach that needs to be done. We're going to work with our community colleges who have got direct lines to their employer base. And that's how we're going to start engaging employers in North Dakota, is through the community colleges that already work with their employers, sometimes on a monthly basis. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you for that, Tracy and Amanda. Very insightful. And before we jump into our questions, we'd like to remind the audience about our LER resource series, which is the inspiration for today's webinar, which goes into the basics, credentials, just as Tracy reviewed, and the portability of LERs. And they are on our resource page on Project Unicorn if you want to check that out a little bit more. So we're going to move into our first question. What future collaborations or partnerships are essential for future success of LER initiatives? Amanda, would you like to start by answering this question?
Sure. And I think some of the things that Tracy was sharing, I think are will reflect directly in the ways that I'm responding to this. Tracy mentioned at the top of his comments that, this is an area that takes a village. And I think in different states that looks different, but he's already pulled out some of the key players and collaborators that are really necessary for this work to move forward. Right now, we've been having some, siloed conversations in states, and they've had a place where the work has some momentum, and they've been leaning in there. But we're at critical junctures in several states where they need to bring in other partners in order to make sure that the interoperability impacts are really felt by folks in the state. So key educational partners, I think, are really important here. The conversation around the language of skills and some of that stuff, that the behind the scenes, work that Tracy was showing about sort of the breakdown of the skill. This is not fast or easy work, but it's something that's a conversation that's happening across workforce and employers, as well as educational pathway providers or the building of new pathways. So the language of skills has to be something that is communicated on and collaborated on amongst a lot of stakeholders and states. And also we're having conversations across state lines about sort of the portability of the work that happens in these LER spaces in a state being portable and valued on the other side in another state context. So I do think within a state, educational partners, as well as employers, and then also sort of the tech and data people, having those conversations together. The tech and sort of the hard tech conversation many times is disconnected from a skills-based pathway conversation. And if it's going to be embedded within digital processes, and we're really going to be thinking about mechanisms to move the skills information around to and through our systems, then folks who are building these technologies or supporting the development of data systems have to be at the table alongside education and workforce folks to connect these dots. Another thing I know that's certainly something we've leaned into a bit with Project Unicorn and the ways in which we've engaged is the K-12 space. There's a lot of issues around more local control around some of these conversations in the K-12 space. So it looks a bit different from that just a state agency saying, we're going to try this, we're going to implement it, because there's some more complexity to that. There's some more layers to get down to the regionality of some of this work around what employers are looking for, the demographics of the student body, and how that plays into the implementation of some of this work. So I do think what we're seeing as being some great forward momentum is, folks who are taking small bites at the apple, but really these foundational pieces, thinking about data, thinking about technology, thinking about key partnerships, and then thinking about the ecosystem of partnerships that exist from there. I do think as people are thinking about what the ecosystem looks like in their state, that they need to be thinking about not only some of these folks who house this data, who are going to be receivers of some of this data or issuers of the data, but also legislators and state policymakers as key partners in this work. What is the language that will speak to them about the work that's being done? Because again, as Tracy showed, this is complex, in the weeds. Most governors now, North Dakota is a little bit different. They've got a tech-focused governor, so he might want to get into the weeds. There's plenty of governors that don't want that level of detail. They want to know, what can this system do? And how can you message up what can an emphasis on interoperability, what can the development of an LER system do for economic mobility, for post-secondary attainment, for post-secondary access, or industry credentialing. So I think we're thinking about the ecosystem of state agencies, local areas, tech providers. All of these things that Tracy mentioned are part of the village of work that he is implementing. But then also, I think state policymakers and legislators to help with the sustainability of the work and the funding and the emphasis around the work and how it's a critical part of priorities around economic mobility and access to really good jobs for folks within a state has to be a part of the thinking around what partnership looks like and the language that can be used to talk about the necessary steps to be taken in this data focused work and the implementation of technologies that can really support some of these next steps.
Thank you for that, Amanda. Our next question will be geared towards Tracy. So what role do state education agencies play in governing the use and dissemination of LERs?
I think, if we stay in the K-12 arena right now and the career and technical education arenas, they have a tough time bringing forward stackable credentials that are based on measured and assessed competencies because of local control. But the SEA, and especially in the CTE arena, working on programs where they can establish the standards of a program such that they can issue credentials that have got currency, and a lot of that is the continuum of education. How does a student in K-12 continue their education in post-secondary or a community college and not retake what they did in K-12? So I know we're working heavily with CT on this area, and it's just a difficult challenge. I mean, I think Idaho has done a good job with their skill stack, because when they award a credential, which is free credit hours in community colleges, the instructor has to log in and attest to the standards being met. So they have their challenges there. At post-secondary, if you want to think of them as an SEA, they are the lowest friction point right now. They've heard the most on credential engines, on credentials. They're aware of Credential Engine. ACRO is involved. That whole community knows it's coming. So I'm really excited to work with a community that is just, I won't have the friction that I have today in other areas. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Is, if the SEAs can also support infrastructure, because community colleges and K-12 schools, they're not bursting with money. Credentialing can get pretty expensive. So if you can provide that infrastructure and services that's available to them, you'll see things roll out much faster.
If I could jump in, Aaron Faye, just to build on a few things that Tracy mentioned. I think some areas of opportunity around SEAs, and this is building off of a couple different areas of our work. But he mentioned, CTE and some of the credentialing spaces. I think some of the metrics around college and career readiness aligned with industry credentialing, there really could be value for districts who have a better space in which to capture the credentials that are being earned. But then also work-based learning is a huge area of emphasis for a lot of governors right now. And they're trying to think, how can we have, high quality work-based learning opportunities for every student within our state? And it's really difficult to gather and capture data on those in our current systems. So I do think there's a lot of opportunity to connect these conversations that are happening to some of those sort of connected priorities that really could benefit from a structure for reporting on some of these things that don't live in sort of the regular transcripts, but are really key and can really support employability or additional, as Tracy mentioned, additional credits, maybe at certain institutions, if you have certain experience. So I do think there's some opportunities for SEAs to be thinking about how to leverage this to fill some internal data gaps, but then also to make it more portable for the learner to take these verified experiences that live outside of the regular transcript to their next education or working experience.
Beautifully said, Tracy and Amanda. The next question we have, we'll gear this towards Tracy. I'm sorry, towards Amanda. What are the key challenges and opportunities in framing LERs conceptually for stakeholders in the education and employment sectors?
Okay, so this is the point at which I get to say some challenges. And these are challenges that I think, the National Governors Association identified early on in this work, that it's a complex topic and messaging it is hard. I spent probably the whole first year of my project work with states, just learning alongside them, talking to them about what is this, but exploring the whole sort of space of learning and employment records. And I think the ideas sometimes outpace the implementation, like the promise of it are outpacing the implementation. So it's hard to, in many states, message the progress and also sort of tie that to investment. So thinking about, what are the outcomes? Well, there's there's not lots of outcomes right now from a fully implemented LER system. But we're seeing pockets of really great work along the continuum of implementation. So early on, I think messaging is a huge challenge, especially for my constituents. They want to be like, why is this important? What is it doing? Is it just digitizing a transcript? Like that's what they want to boil it down and say, what is this? When really it's, and I've come to learn, it's sort of a first step in a really big conversation about new ways in which data will move and can move through our systems. And then it's also sort of the language that we're using. And so interoperability for me, again, not a tech expert, we've got all the technical sort of, this is what interoperability means for data and those, the language that needs to be utilized. But also I think it's sort of, it's also conceptual too. It's like we need to think across systems. We need to think more strategically. Whereas I think a lot of states saw this very early on as like pilots, interesting little pilots in regions that were doing some cool stuff. There's also a smush up of like digital badging and digital credentialing with an interoperability conversation it's hard to make distinctions between the different buckets of work that are happening in states and where those live, because some of those live in very different spaces. Like institutions, higher ed institutions have really leaned into digital badging. They want to badge all the stuff. And they're badging some cool stuff. They're also badging a bunch of stuff that doesn't matter. And so there's a conversation around quality, around data. And then I think one of the things we've come across pretty recently, we've expanded our work into sort of the skills-based talent development more broadly, sort of opportunity for states. And one of the challenges is that a lot of this data that we're creating currently does not get ingested into HRIS systems. So there's a bridge that needs to be built, certainly an opportunity, but right now it's a challenge because I think the education and workforce side and a lot of state systems are doing their best to put data into the right kind of formats, to be moved, to be utilized, to be owned, to be leveraged. And yet there's some roadblocks on the employment side around how that data could be utilized for hiring purposes and for advancement purposes. So I think we see some great opportunities. We still have barriers around messaging, and we still have barriers around connecting the full continuum to see the outcomes of the opportunities that exist with learning and employment record systems. I think interoperability is foundational to this conversation around how the data is going to move. But I do think the use cases for each of these different stakeholder groups are critical to be able to message, to be able to talk to employers and employers' HR leaders about what this data is, how it can enhance their talent development. So all of these different conversations that have to be had at different spaces within sort of the life cycle or the lifeline of a learning and employment record system. There's a lot of challenges. And I think for the K-12 system specifically, I think it's sort of getting the data to capture everything that they're experiencing, everything that they're learning, everything that they're doing, and then making sure that plugs into spaces that value that. So the conversations in between our systems like K-12 and post-secondary or workforce, and making sure we know this is the type of information that's coming in, and then the other side saying, this is how we're going to value it. So that there's a lot of clarity and it's not inconsistent. It's not creating just a digital way to, cement different biases or barriers within our systems, but instead is opening up more opportunity. So I think there's great promise here, but there's still some of those spaces where we're reaching some of those friction points. And I think work like Tracy's that is working across finding those different stakeholders to speak to different populations, I think is going to be a critical next step to show, what can actually be done when this work is implemented across different spaces within our states.
Thank you, Amanda. We will be moving on to the last question before we move on to Q&A, and we'll gear this question towards Tracy. What are the best practices for states to manage and protect student data within LER systems?
Oh, you jump questions on me. When it comes to the minor student and the fact that we used our SLDS system and provided a statewide service and a state wallet, and it is sitting in a database, I do like the opportunity it presents for us to put barriers around minor students. Given that we have our own infrastructure, our own wallet, and our own database, and our own authentication domains, we can actually allow minor students, middle school students, to actually start using wallets in more of a secured environment, or an environment that doesn't allow them to shoot themselves in the foot. So I like what we're doing in that arena. In general, the general nature of an learning and employment record in the form of self-sovereign identity, the self-sovereign usage and identity is really a discipline that we need to look at, because I need to know an individual, and I need to know if they've established a wallet, and I need to know where to find that wallet. Because if I'm going to push information to them when they've been awarded a new certificate or a degree or a credential, I can't do that. I just can't do that without having an address to talk to them with. So from the minor's perspective, I think what we're doing with our infrastructure, we can provide those type of securities. Or when it comes to digital credentialing for the minor students, then you shouldn't probably be deploying or publishing credentials that could be controversial or expose too much PII on behalf of the student. People are going to be struggling and wrestling with this one down the road. Amanda, do you have any thoughts on that?
Oof. It is a quickly evolving space where we're learning about more and more sort of layers of concern that state lawmakers have. Certainly, we are engaging with folks who are around cybersecurity within states, who are thinking about protection not only of our state data systems, but also of the systems of the local areas. There's been a lot of, unfortunately, cyber hacks and ransomware attacks on places that don't have a lot of infrastructure to support security of their data at both the K-12 and the higher ed side. So that's been a huge area of concern. So even just thinking about just basic security infrastructure is a challenge for all of this as we start gathering and utilizing more data. Investment in some of those systems just has to be a priority in order to keep this data safe. And I also think as more of these innovative efforts launch, and as we see maybe regional pilots that we're seeing in some states that are trying to implement some of this stuff, I think consistent engagement with your legislature and the folks who are thinking about the stuff to talk about the safeguards in place, to talk about the procurement process, so that you're not caught up in a wave of panic. If there are ransomware attacks or there are things happening in your state or in neighboring states, it's usually when we start to see legislatures say, oh, we've got to put up some safeguards so that same thing doesn't happen here. And then sometimes folks who are in some of those roles may not have the details of what's actually happening and the work you might be doing. So I think a lot of transparency for not only the legislature, but also for parents. When you're talking about gathering and utilizing student data, we have seen some backlash in a few states of efforts to bring in different types of credentialing providers or ed tech providers that are leveraging a lot of student data and a lot of concerns and questions from parents. And so I think a lot of transparency is around the safeguards, around the usage of data, around the not selling data, which I think a lot of ed tech vendors have, the selling of aggregate forms of data a bunch as a part of their business model. So I think really just the transparency is necessary, especially around the data security piece and privacy piece for minor students, especially because I think there is right now in several states a trend towards not gathering data in order to avoid any of those traps or opportunities to have that data used in bad ways. So a lot stricter data safeguards in order to protect rather than being able to leverage some of the data in really useful ways. So not saying one is better than the other, but certainly I think those are reactions to things that they've seen happen with student data or at the district level. So I think those things always have to be in the back of the mind of the folks who are thinking about this at the state level. Like, how might parents react? How might legislators react? What information do I need to share about how privacy and security are at the forefront of the work that we're doing? And so when those questions arise, you've got that ready answer and the process that you're undertaking to prioritize those issues.
Thank you, Amanda and Tracy. We do have a question that came up through our Q&A segment, our Q&A feature. So the question is, why would credentials expose PII?
That's a good question. Your ID is embedded in a credential. I think a better statement would be expose data that should be considered private, and the student is sharing something that they shouldn't be sharing. And let's say, take a course grade. Do you really want a minor to post their course grade on LinkedIn? But you're correct, and that was probably misworded as far as PII is concerned.
Can I ask you a question, Tracy? What are you seeing as next for you guys? You mentioned partnering with community colleges. You mentioned some of that stakeholder engagement. You have a big group, I know, that you've been working with across the past couple years as your work is iterated. What's next for North Dakota? We're
going to move at scale. We're going to upgrade our wallets so that they're much more user friendly, because like I said, they are an engineer's wallet. And we are going to publish at scale in post-secondary. So we'll work with one community college. We'll be publishing by the end of this first semester this fall. And then we'll expect to see a lot of the other colleges that are interested in this arena adopting and going. So we want to move at scale. We want to publish at scale. We want wallets being used. We want employers getting credentials. And I don't have the workforce concern that others do. I hire people, and I have never not looked at something they sent me. If it's a PDF, if it's a spreadsheet, if it's a link to an HTML site, if it's a digital credential, if I'm interviewing somebody, I'm going to look at what they've got. And so I think this is just kind of an evolution. I want to see credentials flowing, because eventually when people understand that credentials move, driver's license, everything else like that, then having these more difficult skills-based conversations are going to be a lot easier.
And the one other question I had about North Dakota, I mentioned before, you have a techie governor. And I know he's really thinking about AI and its impact on, state efforts, state agencies. I wonder if your office is thinking about leveraging AI tools as a part of this, or if that's part of your planning yet.
Well, the state itself is coming up with an AI strategy. I actually have my public site insights that we are going to be kicking off a proof of concept on generative AI on. We're sticking in the public data realm, and then it will evolve into secured type of AI usage. If you think about it, AI is really the answer for filling up skills banks. I mean, that's what it does, is it reads PDFs and it figures out what's in them. I'm really hoping AI is kind of a savior for job role and work skills and educational competencies to skills, because it's hard, long work to do.
Thank you, Tracy and Amanda. I don't come from a tech background myself, so this has been truly helpful in understanding how all of these different structures work together. Very insightful. We're going to start closing up today's webinar, and we just want to remind the audience that you can stay up to date with Project Unicorn and webinars just like this, and also our resources, where you can again find the 4-part resource series to LERs and interoperability. And we just want to thank you all for joining us today. We hope this webinar has been informative and addressed any questions you may have had about LERs and interoperability. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.